We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Kate and Abbie Show. This is episode 27. And today's topic is demystifying world building. This is one that we've actually gotten quite a few requests from you guys to do, like, do one about world building, do one about world building. Well, if you're one of the listeners who requested that, today's episode is for you because that's what we're talking about is world building, both in contemporary and fantasy. And every other genre. Actually, that's part of the point of this episode is that we're going to demystify what world building really is.
Yes.
So a lot of people, I think, when they hear the term world building, they think of like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or something that's really advanced fantasy or sci-fi with all these different creatures and all these different worlds, something like the Chronicles of Narnia, where you have all these different things that are completely different and made up and are not real world related, something that the author had to imagine themselves and put into the environment aspect of their book.
Yeah.
Whereas what world building really is not just for complicated worlds, not just for worlds where you have dystopian, governments and, creatures and naiads and dryads and whatever. It's not just for that. It's also for every single story that is out there because every single story has a world in it, whether it's contemporary, whether it's fantasy, whether it's sci-fi or mystery or whatever. Your book is going to have a world that the reader is entering, and it's a fictional world, even if it's, quote unquote, the real world, even if it's taking place on Earth in, Illinois, it's still a world that you as the author are building and bringing the reader into. So world building takes place across the board.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And you see that with like white room syndrome, which is, when you go into reading something that's a fictional story of any genre, and you're not really sure what I'm looking at. How can I paint this picture in my head? Because there isn't really enough description. What that really is world building, even if it's just one room, and you haven't really built the image of this fictional world for your reader. So even if it's a contemporary, and we go into a scene not knowing where it's taking place, same deal with a fantasy. So you want to be describing what is going on in this world. What are we looking at right now? Because that's really going to set the stage. So it doesn't matter if it's the real world or if it's a fantasy world.
Right. So to deconstruct that, to kind of strip it down to the bones, it would be constructing the environment of your book. But world building sounds cooler.
Yes.
But it also has this fantasy vibe to it.
Right.
Because everything I see out there about world building always has like fantasy thumbnails.
Yeah.
So,
and they ask you all these questions about magic.
right.
And, like different lands and rulers and stuff. It's like, well, what if it's a contemporary novel?
So then that makes you think, or makes quite a few people think like, oh, that doesn't really apply to me. I don't really have any world building in my book. Not so. You have world building no matter what. You're constructing the environment that you're creating in your book. I've had a lot of questions about this because I have written and published a urban fantasy thriller series. Also, with some of the books are actually more on the paranormal side, the Blood Race series, and there's a lot of world building in those books because of the fantasy aspect. So I get asked a lot about like, oh, how did you do the world building? How did you make world building that complex? And the thing is it's not more or less complicated, the process wise for fantasy or contemporary, because it really has to do with pausing and really getting an understanding yourself as the author of what environment am I writing in. Whether it's someone's house or whether it's, a fantasy, some fantastical magical forest. It really is the same level of difficulty because, and actually contemporary can sometimes be harder. Like it depends on what the circumstance is. If you're writing, someone is in a really like ornate, 1800s library and they're describing what it looks like in the wood paneling and what sort of books are there and maybe there's a fire crackling in the fireplace. Whereas if I'm writing, okay, we're in a magical forest and I just describe what the forest looks like and, okay, there's a fairy or whatever. That might actually end up being less complicated to describe. So it's really not more complicated for fantasy writers or contemporary writers. It really depends on the environment that you are describing per scene.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like one of the problems that a lot of writers run into when they are building a fantasy world in particular is they've come up with all of these great ideas for all the details. And then they start to write like the first scene that takes place in the fantasy world. And they're like, okay, I'm going to start describing things now. And then they kind of start and they can't stop. Or they just like start dumping all of the descriptions, all the details, everything that they've thought of, almost like their notes, just like putting that into the actual book itself. And that's not necessarily a good thing to do all the time.
Right.
It's definitely not a good thing to do because unless it is immediately impacting the characters, it really does not belong in the book itself. Okay, so not saying that everything is going to immediately impact the characters or that nothing will. There will be certain things and certain things throughout the timeline of the story. So I made a video about world building a long time ago and I used Narnia as an example. And I was talking about how, and I know we've talked about Narnia on the podcast before, how the world building that starts very small. And I think that everything, all the world building that I've seen that's really well done, yours included, in The Blood Race, is very small in that it starts from like the one main character, then you care about the main character, you get to know them, and then you see what is immediately impacting them. And it might just be one location, it might just be one element, one magical law of the world, but it's usually only a couple things, only a few things. It's not like the whole idea of this whole world and this whole universe and all the magic systems and the rulers and like that doesn't impact the main character immediately, right? So I think paying attention to what is immediately impacting the main character is a really good focus point to have, even with contemporary or with something that is taking place in the real world, because that's the same thing. Like you could go on and on describing all kinds of different things. You could go into a whole bunch of different locations and start describing tons of stuff that your reader has to know, but they don't necessarily have to know it right now because it's not really impacting the main character right now.
Yeah, it'd be kind of like if you were reading the Chronicles of Narnia. For those of you who are familiar with it, there's tons of different animals and creatures in it. If in the beginning of the book they start like, okay, well, first there's this creature and it's like this and it has the legs of a fawn, but it's really a human. Half of its body's a human. And then there's these like guys that are also horses. And then there's these, buffalo looking thing. You'd be like, oh my gosh, this is so tedious to read through.
Right.
But if we just encounter these creatures as we go, it's like, ooh, that's interesting. New animal. But
yeah.
So
it's having a place of significance in the story for the main character's story. That's why I always say to people that you should be asking yourself what element of this world building is going to immediately impact the MC. And then just do that for now.
And you want to keep them hungry for more. Like you don't want to if you're serving someone like a 10-course meal, you don't want the first like plates of food you give them to be like piled with food. So now they've eaten all that and they're like, I really don't want anything else. I'm so full.
Right.
That's just supposed to be like the salad. Okay. So we want to like slowly get them in. We don't want to be like piling so much on them that they're already like, oh my God, I'm already overwhelmed with what's happening. And I have all this information, but nothing to really connect it with anything meaningful that's happening or anyone that I care about in the story.
Yeah.
So you're right on in that it should
matter.
It should matter, and it should be based on what's affecting the main character,
Right.
because that's why it matters.
Exactly.
So I think like also some of our listeners will probably be thinking, yeah, but for plotting, I want to really figure out the whole fantasy world, which some writers do that, and I think that's really cool if you're into that. If you want to like figure out maps and figure out what creatures and figure out the magic system and have all of that laid out ahead of time, do whatever you want, really whatever works for you. But when it comes down to what you're actually putting into the book, filter it and space it out, because your notes, like you were just saying, you don't want it to feel like they're reading your notes. And sometimes we can get overly enamored with some of the things we create. Like, I'm really obsessed with like this magic system. Okay.
Yeah.
And so then you start seeing like all this stuff in it, which I've even done in my own writing sometimes. And you'll be like, oh, you keep mentioning this thing, but it really doesn't matter that much.
The harsh reality is that nobody cares. So I see this all the time with blurbs, they will go into like talking about the government or the magic system or something about the world, and they'll start that. That'll be like the hook paragraph of the blurb. And I'm like, that's not going to engage anybody. That doesn't tell me anything about why I should care about this book. It's not telling me about what's going to emotionally invest me in this story, because you can't really get emotionally invested in a fictional government system, right? I mean, you're getting emotionally invested in the character.
Right.
So starting with the character, like you can mention the government system or the magic system later in the blurb or in the book. But starting with the character is so, so important. Starting with them and their internal conflict, because that's what's going to make the reader care. And then from there, they will care about what's impacting the main character about the world that they live in.
Right.
But the world by itself, no. I mean, it might be really great and unique, but no, it's not going to be emotionally engaging for people.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and that's so key, because really there is hardly any like unique intricacies of world building that haven't been done before.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that it's all kind of been done before.
Yeah.
Now, that's not bad. But when you look at, I remember listening to a masterclass trailer, I think it was the director, Ron Howard, talking about directing movies. And he's like, really, there's only 7 stories. And I thought that's such an interesting statement, because it's true, because most stories follow, this general storyline. Oh, fantasy world in peril, the chosen one saves the day. How many thousands of books are like that? So, and have similar world building, have, the magical forest, the fairies, the witches, the wizards, whatever, dragons, war, that's all happened many, many times. But what makes it unique is your character and their perspective that you uniquely bring to it. That makes the world building pop and really stand out, is not so much the world building itself, but how that character is experiencing it and processing it. And of course, there are unique twists that you will put on your world building that will be different from anyone else's. So I'm certainly not saying that, oh, there's nothing unique. But what I mean is, generally, it's going to feel that's why, like, you can look at reviews for any given book, my own books, and have people, you'll see reviewers saying, this reminds me of this book. This was kind of like this book crossed with this book. That's because there's really nothing new. There's very few things that are new. Most of this stuff has been done before. So what makes it unique? The character and their internal conflict and how they're facing this world that you've created.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%. And that's where you bring the unique. That's where you bring your originality to it, because only you can write this character's internal emotional journey the way that you're writing it.
Right.
And because only you have this insight with this specific character. So that's where, you start getting into the details of what is going on emotionally inside my characters, and that becomes very exciting for you as the author, because then you know that you can really create something very unique here, something very memorable. And if you're only relying on your plot and your world building to be unique, you're going to be very disappointed when you start looking around at other books that are similar, and you're going to be like, oh, someone else did that. They stole my
Right.
idea. And even if they didn't steal your idea, it's been done before. So you can't just fall back on that as this is what makes my book unique, because it won't be. You know,
Right.
it's this combination of things. It's especially the internal emotional journey of the character. That's really what's going to be making it unique. And your insight that you are giving to, that you're bringing to this story, that is what really makes it your own.
Right. Exactly. That is totally what makes it different and unique. And I think that, like you were saying, we can get so bogged down in the weeds of like how much detail is involved with our worlds, how much, you know, the readers need to know about the magic system and, you know, the government and all this stuff. And I think a lot of times as writers, because we're so close to it, and this is where beta readers can be really helpful in this aspect, is how much information does your reader need about your world? Like, literally. They barely need anything to go off of. There's like, I feel like a lot of writers, myself included, in the past, I've made this mistake, and I've had beta readers say to me, like, I already got that like 3 paragraphs ago. I get what it is. It's a tree that looks like this, and I've got it. So you don't need as much detail as you think, because you as the author, you're like, yeah, but they need to understand that the bark is swirled like this, and this like underside of it has like this slightly pinkish color. And if they don't know that, then what? They won't understand the story. Like, said no one ever. That's not going to happen. They really don't need a lot. And if it's something unique and that's actually you want to draw their attention to, you need to make sure that you're not being so descriptive with every single thing, because you're kind of spending all their attention currency on everything, so that by the time they get to the thing, you're like, oh, now this is the really special thing that I want to grab their attention. Well, they're like, I'm already still trying to process all these other things that the author keeps drawing my attention to. Like, ooh, look at this. Ooh, look at this. It's like, I don't even know where to look anymore. I'm still trying to I'm so bogged down with trying to understand what it is I'm looking at. So you know what I mean? Like, it's like if you figure out and prioritize what are the things that are really actually important that you want to stand out, and then let the other details fall back enough to let that thing stand out, and not just have everything is equally described, because then nothing's going to stand out. It's kind of like we were talking about recently with movies that have so much action sequence in them that the whole thing is like an action sequence, so that when you get to the climax, it doesn't even feel like a climax anymore, because it's like the whole thing has just been like, the whole entire time. Yeah. That's kind of what it is in books. The action really is the descriptions that you're giving to everything. Right?
Yeah, 100%. And in the way of descriptions, I think another thing that people have, or writers, I know myself, I've kind of struggled with the thought of this, with writing things that aren't taking place in the real world, that are like more magical or strange, that are made up. Is like, how do you describe something that is completely fictional, that would not happen in the real world, like whether it's a magical power or something that's really unique? And you have a lot of this in The Blood Race, so I want to hear your take on it. But I know that you've told me in the past that one of the things you do, and I've seen you do it, and I've seen other people do it, and I'm like, that's a really cool technique that kind of just blends in with the background, and you don't even notice it happening. To help you see what it is that's being described, is to use metaphorical language that relates to something that you are familiar with in the real world.
Yes, exactly.
Because I've seen you do that in The Blood Race, and that really helps to like get the image of what you're describing.
Exactly, because what you're trying to do is, how can I as quickly as possible communicate to the reader what they're looking at? And that's all it ever is. So how do I get their brain there in the fastest possible way? You're probably going to get their brain to the destination eventually, but the key is to always be like, what's the fastest way to get them there so that they can quickly move on? And it's not like, wait, let me read that again. So like, let's say, you have a cloud of like some kind of magical dust that's dispersing from, a magical plant. Okay. And like, you can describe it like, the particles of a strange luminescent substance drifted through the air in different geometrical patterns and then dispersed into a cloud. And I'm kind of like, oh, what am I? Okay, I kind of see that. But if you're like, the strange pollen dispersed like a swarm of bees. I know what a swarm of bees looks like. Cool.
Right.
Okay, I get it. It's like a cloud. It's kind of like going all over the place.
Right.
And then I like my brain got there right away because I know what a swarm of bees looks like. But if you use too much of your own, and especially books that have like their own language and terms about things, which is a thing, then it's like I don't really know what it is, and it takes me a long time to like get to that place where I know what it is you're talking
Those
about.
books where you need like a whole separate glossary just to
Exactly.
understand what is even happening, and they have like all these weird names for
Right.
things that are very normal
Right, exactly.
to sound cool.
So now let's dedicate a little time to talking about world building in contemporary, because that's how we started this whole episode off, was talking about the fact that world building takes place everywhere. It's just constructing the environment in your story. We went over it in fantasy, how you can use comparisons from the real world to really get someone's brain there quickly. We talked about making sure it matters to the character. All those things are very important for fantasy, but it's also super important in contemporary world building. So like, what was some of the world building that you dealt with writing 100 Days? And also just all the other contemporary books that you've written?
Well, really, with every contemporary book, it's interesting because it is its own fictional world, even though it does take place in the real world technically. The town in 100 Days of Sunlight is fictional, but it's based off of my town and towns in my surrounding area, just like a small town, country-ish vibe. And what I like to do first with world building for every contemporary book that I write, every book I write, but I write mostly contemporary, is what I first do is I make a very short list of the vibe that I want the settings to have. So I like each book to have like its own vibe as far as the world goes. And that has to do with obviously what locations are in the book and what's going on in those locations, but it also has to do with like the mood. So if it's like more of a mysterious or more like thoughtful, literary-ish sort of vibe, I might want it to be more like coastal or like rainy, like just different things that cast a different mood on the settings, I guess is what I mean.
Kind of the energy you're bringing to the writing.
Exactly.
Sorta,
Whereas
right?
like 100 Days of Sunlight is supposed to be more like optimistic feeling, happy summer vibes. More of like a rom-com will have more of like, you know, more of a sunny, summery vibe. Whereas you might have, it has a whole different vibe than like a book set in winter in like a really snowy place. I feel like I'm explaining this badly, but what
No,
I like
that makes
to do,
total sense.
what I like to do is like make a list of like the vibe with very, very short like bullet point descriptions of different things like moody, rainy days, you know, a coastal setting, or like something that, you know, I'll just like list out a bunch of different things that are like elements of the world. Okay, it might be a small town or it might be a city. It might be a beach town. It might be a place out in the middle of nowhere, a town out in the middle of nowhere in the Midwest. So all of these things I'm describing completely change the way the book feels. It changes the way that the world feels in the fictional world. And I think it's important to make those descriptions for yourself, even if it's just a small list of things. So that way you're staying more focused on the energy and the vibe that you want this setting to have, and you're not all over the place. So it really creates a whole mood. And that's one of the vital things that I do for world building in contemporary. Another thing that I do is I make location sketches. So I'll have a location folder in my Scrivener project for each book, and I'll make like sketches for each location. And the sketch usually includes like a picture from Pinterest that inspires me and makes me think of that location, or looks sort of like how I imagine that location to look. And then I'll make a separate list of the same sort of thing, same sort of vibe list, but just for that one location. So like very basic descriptions just for my own purposes of the kind of mood that this location has, and maybe some specific details about like who lives there or what's going on there. Why is this location important to the story? So I would say that with contemporary, it's more minimal, but it's definitely there. It's definitely a thing. World building is definitely a thing. And it's fun because you can play around with different things. I think a lot of people probably think that contemporary world building is boring or it looks boring from the start or just like, observing it from afar. But really, it's not boring because you can play around with a lot of different elements and make it unique, even if it's something that actually exists in the real world. It can still be unique and engaging and moody.
Yeah, that's really what adds the flavor to a book.
Yeah.
When someone how many times have you heard a reader say like, "Oh, I love the feel of that book. I love the vibe of that book. I'm rereading that book just because I love the feel of it so much." What they're really talking about is the atmosphere that you've built.
Atmosphere. That's the perfect word. Atmosphere.
The atmosphere.
Yes.
And so many of those books oftentimes are literary, women's fiction, young adult romance. So it doesn't have to be a fantasy book.
Yeah.
And it's about those are the things that create the flavor.
Yeah. Exactly. And especially with like contemporary, I think a lot of people go to that for the atmosphere of like coziness. Like they like the cozy feeling.
Right.
Like I've seen so many people talk about contemporary books that are like more just fluffy and not really a lot that goes on in them. But they have like a specific atmosphere that's like cozy and just like lighthearted.
Yeah.
And I think people go to that for just to change the way they feel,
Right.
It's like you're stepping into another fictional world. And even though it might technically take place on planet Earth and you're familiar with planet Earth, it still is an escape.
Right.
So
And
I
it's,
think
it's
that's-
still your own unique version of planet Earth.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's 100% legit world building. So it is just as intense for contemporary. It may be different because, you're not describing like, paranormal creatures or something like that, a magic system or dragons or wizards or something. But that doesn't mean that it's any less complex because you could very simply describe a dragon and you could also very complexly describe something simple and everyday.
Right.
And you see that in literature all the time. So it's about it's about who's writing it and their personality, bringing their own personality to the writing. So it doesn't mean that contemporary world building is any less. World building is world building is world building. And it happens in every single piece of literature. And the key is really, why does it matter to the character? Do my readers need to know this information now? Or can I allow them to learn it as they see it through the character's eyes? And I think we've gone over quite a few good tips.
Yeah.
Comment below and let us know if you're working on the world building aspect of a current work in progress. If it's a fantasy, if it's contemporary, let us know your thoughts on the different types of world building and what you've personally experienced with your own writing. We would love to hear from you. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so at
Patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show.
And it's always a huge, amazing thing when you guys share the show. We always really appreciate that. So if you want to share it with a writer who you think could use a creative boost, that'd be amazing. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Stay stoked.
And rock on.